Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to sketch a couple of little robins, one standing and one in flight, using some simple graphite and lots of curiosity and compassion. And we're going to talk about how important it is to spend time finding shapes before diving into details. Let's get going. Hello and welcome back to this little wild studio of mine. This is the third time I've recorded the beginning because I keep saying sparrow instead of robin. We're going to draw some robins and let's see if I say sparrow yet again. This is going to be a fairly quick and easy video, I think. I don't know, we'll see what happens. Sometimes things pop up and what you think is going to be easy is not necessarily the way that it turns out, but that's where we bring curiosity in all the time. So if you haven't watched last week's video, we talked about shapes first, which we're going to do again this time, value, so getting from dark to light, and then curiosity and compassion. So always try and approach your work with both curiosity and compassion. Compassion for what you're studying and compassion for yourself as well. So I'm giving myself compassion for saying sparrow and having to re-record 3 times. And mostly I'm just going to dive in here and do a little bit of sketching. And I will give you a link to a folder on Pixabay where you can choose from, I don't know, hundreds of different robin, not sparrow, but also sparrow too, different robin photos. And you can create a whole collection of little robins. They're a really delightful little bird to draw when you're first learning, particularly about shapes, etc., because they have such a rounded little body, a small rounded little head, and a fairly streamlined shape, which makes it nice and simple to get those shapes moving into form. And so I think I'm going to have a little go sketching, and I will record a little voiceover to go over this, talking more about all of the wonderful things that we need to have as artists, as creatives, that are above and beyond observational and hand-eye coordination. All right, I'll see you back here in a little bit. As always, we begin our sketches with the big and basic shapes. That's how we grow our observation, is finding those big shapes first and then being able to carve into them the same way a sculptor would. So from a big block of stone, we move to the big basic shapes and then just keep making small adjustments to get those smaller shapes over time. If it helps, think of those larger shapes like a silhouette. So what you would see were the being that you're drawing was in complete darkness and there was light around them. So what would be that overall big shape that they are made up of? Also think about how you can use your other senses here to help describe those shapes. So what would it feel like to pat this little being? Use your hand and your imagination to go around the curves of that silhouette, over the head, over the body. Feel the roundness of form, feel those really big shapes without details, and try and describe that with your pencil. Particularly at the beginning of a sketch, I think it's a great idea to try and keep your pencil on the paper as much as you can, and keep your eye on your reference and just get scribbling. Work lightly and loosely and keep moving around. The more you see, the more you will see. The more attention you pay, the more you're going to see detail and the way that there's relationships between different aspects of form, be that an anatomical accuracy, for example, the way that the beak and the eye line up, or whether it's a unique aspect of the reference photo that you're working with. The big thing is to take your time, work at the speed of you. There's no rush. You will inevitably get quicker the longer you practice, the more you practice, the more skill you grow when you are looking, observing, really seeing deeply. But there's no prize for going super fast. Things just take time. Creating beauty takes time. So what you see in this, 18-minute tutorial actually took about an hour to do altogether. And I work fairly quickly because I've been doing this for a while now. While I continue on with the sketch here, honing down from those larger shapes to smaller and smaller shapes, and eventually bringing in value in order to describe form, so roundedness of form, I want to talk a little bit more about not going into details straight away. We want to get those basics down, and you want to be confident and courageous enough to tackle more detail. And detail is approached in exactly the same way, finding shapes and then building out form. It's just all happening in smaller sizes. But the beginning of a wildlife sketch is where less is more. So you want to focus on capturing that silhouette, that distinctive outline of your subject, rather than getting lost in those intricate details. It's an approach that not only simplifies the sketching process, but it emphasizes the unique characteristics that define the being that you're studying. The detail of your drawing is going to be built on that structure, that initial framework, your silhouette or large shapes. So you want to spend some time there building your skills in that area. And I think doing lots and lots of sketches that really don't go past that initial outline can be extremely helpful. When we're looking at that outline, we want to think about what the being is doing in the reference. Are they in a relaxed shape, for example? We want to make sure that we don't start looking at the details straight away. We want to get that essential shape. We want to get the angles, the proportions of those large details before we head into something like the eye. Our brains can't handle all that detail at once. We can't manage all of that information. So we have to make it easy to not get overwhelmed by detail and want to continue. So keep scanning your eye around the wild being. Think about how it would be to pat them, how the roundedness sits under your hand. Stroke down their back, for example. Take note of the angles of their head and neck and torso and legs. And inevitably, when you're doing that with lions and tigers and bears, it's going to be the safest way ever for you to pat them. Imagine with that silhouette that the being is in front of you. Try and make that shape quite concrete to yourself rather than nebulous. I know it sounds silly, and we know that photographs capture 2 dimensions when what's actually 3-dimensional. But it can be easy to gloss over that when we're working from a photo, and we're also transcribing that onto a 2-dimensional plane again, or essentially 2-dimensional. We need to remind ourselves all the time that there's no hard edges, that their form takes up space, and that there is roundedness. Remember that each photo reference is unique, each individual being in these photos is unique. So really observe what you're seeing and think about the individual that you are actually honouring by looking at this reference. See, and then see deeper still, and you'll start to find relationships between anatomical structures, and that we can use circles and ovals and lines to connect these, and that it's going to be different for each reference. And of course, you'll find similarities across one species. So doing an exercise like this, where we're looking at robin in a few different poses, is fantastic, because we start to figure out the relationship of robin's head and body and legs. But I also want you to think of them as each unique little being and find connection in the fact that you are sharing a moment in time with this creature. That brief moment where a photo was taken. You want to move lightly and loosely, as I said, try and capture the vitality of the being in motion or standing still. Try and think about visually engaging with them and understanding that they are full of life. We also want to remember that we are full of life too. So try not to tense up, try not to feel too confined or constrained. Keep your eyebrows down, loosen your shoulders and neck. I always find it helpful to try and embody the being that I'm working with in a sense as well. What would it feel like to have wings, for example? How could I roll my shoulders right now and feel like Robin? How could I flit those little shoulders around to turn into wings that allow me to fly vast distances for my size? I've found on my own journey that I've become faster and faster with initial shapes, and that's purely down to practice and expanding skills of observation and hand-to-eye coordination. So don't feel rushed. As I said, take your time. But also don't spend too much time overthinking the process as well. I want you to infuse a sense of freedom and flow into your movements, which is why I really advocate for using large, loose, repetitive movement to sort of hone down your sketches rather than going in tight and hard with a heavy touch straight away. You want to be sort of scribbly around that. They're your working lines. Learn to love and appreciate them. They tell a story in your art making. They're your lines of discovery. This is how we show that a human being is making this art, not a machine. It's not AI. I call those initial shapes my finding scribbles. So I want to spend more time looking at the reference than my page. It feels kind of strange to start off with, and you're going to put lines all over the place. But as you develop your hand-eye coordination, your deep observation, it'll start to become second nature. We want our eyes to be looking at that photo as often as possible, unencumbered by the stories that our brains tell us, and try to make the process go faster. Our brains are very happy to stick to the ways we were shown to draw when we were kids. They feel like they've completed that task, and in an effort to keep moving on to the next thing, will try and override what you're seeing. So this is where it's important to take your time to be intentional and really deeply observe the reference with an open heart and mind. So once we move forward from finding those big shapes and then putting in some smaller shapes and then some smaller shapes again, I also want you to think about the importance of balancing detail and what's the difference between an expressive sketch in your sketchbook, for example, that really tells the story of a being versus something that's really realistic and can take, 20, 30, 40 hours to complete. So certain features, when highlighted, can bring your subjects to life and provide that embrace of recognition, I guess, that compassion and connection from the viewer. And also from you as the artist. And generally this comes from the eyes and the expression of that being. We inherently connect through eye-to-eye contact because we are communal beings. And the eyes and face is where I spend most of my time, both on relatively quick sketches and in highly detailed paintings. And you can make a decision as the artist to not make the whole piece as detailed as you might in the face. So experiment with incorporating just enough detail to evoke the spirit of the wildlife that you're sketching without overwhelming yourself or focusing on aspects that don't actually add anything to the story you're portraying, unless you find it really interesting. Because remember that there are no rules.
You get to make your practice everything that you want and need it to be. It doesn't mean that you have to render every single hair, but you can portray the feeling of fur. I think once you feel more confident in finding those basic shapes of wildlife, you might like to explore further just where you want to put the detail. Developing your own style comes literally with practice. You can't pursue it as much as you can develop it from exploring and practicing and practicing and practicing a little bit more. Do you get the sense there's some practicing involved? Because like every skill, it requires practice. Drawing requires practice. Painting requires practice. Observation requires practice. Your style is a reflection of your observations, your interpretations, your personal connection to the natural world. It's not something you have to chase. It's something that comes with the doing. The work is always in the doing. When you're immersed in the principles of shape and form as a guide, your sketches will start to transform from representations to vibrant expressions of the living, breathing subject that inspires you, that you are observing. I want to remind you to approach not only the being that you're working with compassion, but also yourself. You're a human animal, and how exquisite is it to think that using your opposable thumb, you can pick up something that contains a pigment of some description and drag it over a surface and create something that wasn't there before. That's nothing short of magical. You, my friend, are magical. When we have compassion for ourselves and our journey in this work, we're much more likely to allow ourselves the space and the freedom to learn. We can start being curious and asking questions about how you might like to do something differently next time, how it could feel to use the tool this way instead. What could it be like if I have these expansive, abundant thoughts instead of letting myself be overpowered by fear and scarcity? All of those things are absolutely normal in a creative practice, but we can question them and we can show up and do the work anyway. As always, this is a joyous, expansive, abundant, wonderful adventure creating art. And you're doing the most rebellious, gorgeous thing by showing up and taking good care of yourself, by being curious and courageous, by being compassionate and conscious and seeking connection over perfection. All right, my friends, next week we're going to look at a robin again, and this time we're going to add some coloured pencil. And I'm really looking forward to doing that with you. As always, the full tutorials are in Hedgerow, and if you would love to join this beautifully abundant, supportive community that is growing out of a hedgerow, that is growing out of safety and inclusion and celebration, then follow the link and come on over to Hedgerow. Until then, I'll see you next week. Keep sketching, stay curious and compassionate, and let your creativity connect you to what is wild and wondrous in this world. And that includes you.